So our first speaker is Mr. Sai Deepak. Many of you already know him. There we go. All right. Can we hear us? Okay, perfect.
Am I audible?
Good?
Oh,
okay,
yeah,
perfect. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive right in. So, Mr. Deepak, you've written a lot about, in recent years, about India's history. You've commented a lot about of India's history, and in the last few years, there's been a lot more interest, both in India but around the world, about what India's history really is and how to talk about it. So you've commented on the socio-cultural, socio-political sort of churn that's going on in Indian society right now. So especially for those of us who are, like myself, Indo-American, could you please summarize and explain what is going on in India? What is this new interest in history from the level of people and from the level of the state? Could you summarize that for us?
So first of all, thanks to CPEC for giving me an opportunity to interact with the audience here. I think it's a fantastic lineup. I wish I had the time to stay back. I'd request everyone to stay back right until the evening, especially to listen to Mr. Sanyal, who's here. I genuinely don't think I have the kind of vision to summarize what's happening in Bharat, because I've seen this purely from the lens of my personal journey.
Okay.
And I suspect that at the very least, there's a significant cross-section of Bharat's population which relates to my journey. And that explains why there are people who consume what I have to offer. I think what has happened is you could perhaps compare the journey of a middle-class Indian family of the 90s with the journey of Bharat and the trajectory of the journey post-liberalization with Bharat's journey. So when you're trying to make ends meet and you're competing with self-imposed fetters on your ability to innovate and generate wealth, culture typically takes a backseat. And therefore, you're trying to make the most of the opportunities that come your way. English education has typically been seen as the ladder to climb the social ladder, or the means to climb the social ladder. And that largely defines people, at least from my generation, and at least 2 generations thereafter. That, in a sense, is a microcosmic representation of Bharat's journey as well. My own sense is, if Bharat had not adopted the proto-Soviet model, so to speak, and had liberalized the market much before, in addition to, of course, setting up certain public sector units, which was very important for a nascent, fledgling, independent country, this so-called churn or journey that you're witnessing in, let's say, in the 2000s and post that, would have been advanced by a couple of decades. Because you're looking at the fulfillment of Maslow's needs at a larger scale, where once people know that they have the innate ability to generate wealth, which they've always had, they then look out for cultural aspects to reclaim what they believe has been taken from them or has been distorted. So that, I think, is more or less the generation or the journey that we're currently witnessing. And the good part is people are hungry for knowledge about the past.
Right.
There is a very conscious awakening that what most of us have consumed or have been put through our schooling may not represent the reality, and that the education curriculum of this country, of Bharat, has been significantly politically shaped by those who took forward the policy of the colonizer significantly. And therefore, that sense of self-loathing which was drilled into your heads through the education system is being rebelled at by the generation of the 90s, which I represent. So if you look at most people who are vocally rebelling against the system, which we have inherited and have taken for granted, are the ones who have come through the system and therefore have an acute knowledge of what it does to you, and are grateful for the cultural filters which we managed to retain despite the education system and not because of it. And that, I think, is the journey that you currently are seeing. And I don't think it's the end of it. This is merely the beginning. I see this playing itself out for the next 25 years at the very least. There are 2 very different aspects to it. One is dealing with challenges which are external, and the second is dealing with challenges which are internal, both of which are equally important. Because there's a question which most of us are trying to address: who are we? What's our identity?
Right.
And if you look at social media debates today, or even outside of that, there's a significant conversation where people who believe they come from the same ideological school of thought also have a significant diversity of opinion, perhaps even diametrically opposite opinions on the same subject. So politically, they may be the same. Broadly speaking, in terms of ideological tent, they could be under the same umbrella. But within that, there is so much scope for diversity and severe disagreement that I think it bodes well. Because what that means is that the Overton window has shifted from the left, away from the left significantly. And if I've dropped the L-bomb, so be it.
Yeah.
So it's moved significantly away from the left.
Sure.
And now there is a lot of conversation happening within the non-left, not the right. There's a significant difference. At least I don't subscribe to the concept of a right or a left. So that I think is very interesting, which means the rules of the debate, the operating conditions or the boundary conditions within which we operate today are significantly being still determined, defined, and circumscribed by members of the non-left. And that will continue to be the way of the future because we are still trying to figure out the building blocks of the conversation. We are still, according to me, at time T0.
Got it.
So I'm happy to be a part of this exciting generation, and I'm happy to be a part of this fortunate generation because I think we are reaping the benefits of the sacrifices of several generations of people who went unrecognized and whose contribution towards awakening the Indic consciousness went unrequited, so to speak. So I think this is a culmination of their efforts and not solo efforts.
Understood. I'm afraid if you keep getting applause forever, I might not get through all my questions, so I'll press on here.
And I hope the audience is under no compulsion to.
One thing I wanted to ask. So I mean, it is interesting how you say that there's this sort of this self-imposed sort of mentality that has lasted for generations. You know, today in India we hear debates about well, India is a secular democracy. It's a constitutional. We have a liberal order. We have a constitution, a secular constitution. But now you're talking about sort of what the next 25 years will look like. Is as a constitutional country, as a country that was whose constitution is sort of framed to be a secular country and like as a traditional liberal democracy, how do we deal with the sort of rising tide that you're talking about of history in Bharat, in this Indic way of thinking? And a lot of people ask, what role do minorities or people who do not subscribe to that Indic mentality have, not only just in India but also in people who love to think about India who are outside of India, like everyone here?
Right. I think the jury is still out on whether the Constitution was meant to be a secular document in the first place. I haven't seen the evidence for it.
Okay.
I haven't seen the evidence for it.
Okay.
And as someone who practices that area of law as one of my areas of core competence, I have been forced to revisit my own previously held notions as part of the research for the books. And second, I said this as much as part of my submissions before the Supreme Court, before a constitution bench, that why do we start with the assumption that the Constitution of Bharat is a liberal document? What is the basis for it? Is that an aspirational goal, or is that an axiomatic truth? In either case, I'd like to challenge it. Because I don't see liberalism as something that I wish to worship. And I don't subscribe to those values at all under any circumstances. And I don't want liberalism to define Bharatiya ethos. Bharatiya ethos will be defined by Bharatiya values, not by something that's been imported from outside. Bearing in mind our historical realities, our exigencies, so to speak, and certain aspects of our history which have presented us with certain legacy issues which we continue to deal with. I don't know if we're dealing with it, but we hope to. So as far as I'm concerned, I perhaps am at disagreement with the premise of the question. That's one. Second, I don't think Bharat has ever needed a secular constitution to accommodate people of various hues. It's one thing to say that Bharat is a multi-religious society. It's one thing to say that it's a plural society, but it's another thing to take away its own sense of native identity. And I don't believe that Bharat needs to alienate its native identity in order for it to accommodate other identities at all in the first place. That has never been the case. The problem, I think, arises when matter and antimatter choose to coexist. Can they? And question of coexistence should never be answered by one community. That should always be answered by all communities in question who are let's say, stakeholders in the question of coexistence. And there, I think, the simpler way to look at it would be this. There is a civilizational identity which is not just cultural. Dare I say, it is religious. There is a religious component to it, and there is no need to run away from it. But that need not present a problem or an existential threat to the survival of religious minorities. Bharat is not the Europe of the First World War and the Second World War. So we don't need to suffer from European guilt under any circumstances. Europe's experience with respect to treatment of its religious minorities has not been Bharat's experience. So we don't need to suffer that foisting and that imposition under any circumstances. In fact, we have a much better track record, historically speaking. When we never had a constitution in the first place, we have accommodated the most persecuted communities from across the world, be it the Parsis or the Jews, right? Where was the Indian constitution when the Jews were accommodated in this country, in Bharat? There was no concept of a constitution in the European sense. Because you have to make room for an account for our civilizational ethos, which is fundamentally pluralistic. So long as you do not pit yourself against the values of Bharat. That is a red line, a line in the sand that every society is entitled to draw, and Bharat as a sovereign society and culture in the first place is certainly entitled to draw in light of the multiple waves of invasions it's seen, the waves of colonization it's seen, the waves of settler colonialism it has witnessed. So I don't see a problem at all. You have to realize that 50 kilometers away from Delhi, nobody knows the constitution. So it's not the constitution that's protecting people. In a country that's the size of Bharat, with 1.4 billion population, do you really think people walk around with the constitution? Can I do this? Does the constitution permit me to do this or not?
Right.
I don't think that's how it works.
Right.
You should ask a simpler question. Why is it that in a country of the size and scale of Bharat, which is actually a subcontinent that masquerades as a country, and with the kind of resource deficit it has, why is it still largely peaceful? How many countries can you imagine with the best of first world facilities which can manage the population of Bharat, and even if the size is bigger? I don't think that's going to happen.
Right.
Because you depend on law and order, but Bharat society functions on an internal cultural barometer. Never underestimate that.
Right.
So rule of law is good, but there is a rule of Dharma that precedes the rule of law, which has animated Bharat society for generations, for eons. And that, I hope, continues to be the way, because if you hope to put faith entirely in the legal basket, allow me to say this as a lawyer, it's a self-defeating proposition for a lawyer to make. The justice dispensation system rarely works in most jurisdictions, and it works for people with deep pockets. For everybody else, there's Dharma, period.
You know, it's really interesting, this wave that you talk about of interest that's happening, that interest that takes place in Bharat's history and Bharat's culture. Do you see it as something, we talk about how it's happening in India as a consequence of, people are now more economically prosperous, people have this new interest, but seated in front of you are primarily members of the diaspora community. So a lot of people, I would guess, who in that sort of 90s generation that you're talking about, came to the United States in seek of economic opportunity. Do you see that the same vigor of rising interest in that history and that culture? Do you think that it's sort of on the right track, or do you think that it's going in a non-productive direction?
Perhaps I should say this with members of the generation being present. The vigor is present much more now than before.
Understood.
Okay. I'm not blaming any particular generation, because I think each generation has been presented with its own set of challenges.
Right.
Right? So I'm not going to take pot shots at any generation. But the fact is that the generation of the 70s, 80s, and 90s is sitting up and taking notice of Bharat as an exciting story that they now wish to be a part of.
Right.
Right? Right. Which I think is welcome. It's fantastic. So I certainly believe that the resurgence in Bharat's past is a product of, it's not a single variable equation. There are multiple factors here: geopolitical, religious, cultural, economic, whatnot. But this is here to stay, and I think it's not going back from here. Now, the second part of your question, which I think is more important, is it going in a productive direction or is it non-generative? If conversations are limited to social media battles, they will never be generative. And the hope has been that people who wish to be at the forefront of it, or at least contribute their might to it, produce content which lasts the test of time and not social media attention span. There being a very clear difference between the two. And which is why when you look at stellar individuals such as Mr. Sanyal, Mr. Sampath, and several people from the US who've contributed in this direction, I'm happy about the fact that more and more people are interested in producing works, the written work. And that is proof of whether you're moving in the right direction or not. So there are two aspects to it, which is the supply side and the demand side. The good part is there is a supply side. And the fact that the supply side has been met with resounding success over the last half a decade is proof of the existence of a demand side. Okay, so the audience is ready. So this takes you to a slightly different meta aspect, which is the presence of a ready audience is the reason for the shift of the Overton window in 2014. The presence of the ready audience is the reason why multiple such options are being thrown up to ensure that this is no more a solo act, that there is a line of succession in place, at least in people's headspaces. It's also throwing up people who are contributing to the cultural movement. It's also producing people who are contributing to the tech side in the hope that they contribute to the cultural movement. So these conversations are not happening in silos anymore. And there's a reason for it. If a certain platform chooses to deplatform people like me because it believes that I'm dangerous, then we need alternatives. And I think those alternatives are work in progress. So we will not be dependent on platforms provided by the West anymore to ventilate our points of view. And that sense of Atmanirbharta or independence is very, very crucial. So I'm very happy to note that innovation is not just happening in the economic space, it's also happening in the techno-cultural space. That's crucial. That's proof of the fact that we are thinking ahead. So I think exciting times are ahead.
Perfect. I want to talk a little bit more about the diaspora sort of community. Like, there's this rising tide. There's a rising tide of interest in Bharat from that Indic point of view. A lot of the people seated here, especially we're in the Bay Area, so tech, healthcare. These are all fields that people are contributing to here in the U.S. and hopefully by extension to India. But this is an election year, both in the United States, and in India.
There comes the landmine.
Yeah, we're going to get there at some point. Without asking you what your predictions are, what I would like to ask is sort of.
I'm not the one to shy away from predictions.
I know. So while one thing that's always stood out to me. So I grew up in Texas. So I grew up in a pretty red part of this country, and I grew up in a family who supports a lot of the sort of sociocultural shift that's going on in India. One thing that's always perplexed me is the sort of difference in opinions that people have in the United States context and in the Indian context. Do you see the sort of this new this Indic awakening, let's call it, the way people are thinking? Do you see that that change in confidence, that new mindset, as something that's applicable to thought outside of India and in the United States diaspora in particular, but maybe elsewhere? And if so, what bearing does that have for how members of the diaspora contribute to politics or to policy in the countries in which they reside?
So I think around the last elections of the US, I saw quite a bit of heated exchanges happening between the Indian diaspora and members in Bharat, each of them trying to outdo the other on their political acumen and their reading of the situation. people who had barely lived in the US for 6 months had suddenly become political pundits on US political history.
That's honestly longer than some
Right.
people at Stanford, but yeah.
Right. I think they acquired political acumen faster than they could acquire the accent of the US.
Yeah.
So, what it revealed was that Indic thought in the US Indian diaspora is perhaps equally divided between the blue and red states.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why one of the things that I decided to do was to recede from the conversation for a very different reason altogether, because that conversation seemed more like an investment in a political ego as opposed to what matters to me and which is my bottom line in all conversations, civilizational interest. I have very little interest in political outcomes if it does not have a tangible bearing on my civilizational interest. So in that sense, you can call me a single agenda fanatic if you want. I have no problems whatsoever being branded as such. And that has been my approach both in Bharat as well as outside of it.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody who advances our interest as a civilization will be seen as a viable option. Now, how that lands on people is for them to ask that question of themselves in terms of how they rank their priorities and what those priorities are.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in only two things. This is in the specific context of Indian diaspora here, or Bharatiya diaspora in the US. Their safety. Whoever can ensure their safety will take precedence for me.
Mm-hmm.
Whoever can ensure that they continue to contribute productively to this country's economy without having to think of possible ghettoization.
Mm-hmm.
I will think of those options. Mm-hmm. Whoever does not have an overt or covert animus towards Bharat, those are my options. Mm-hmm. Whoever understands that it's best to stay out of Bharat's internal politics, that's my option. These are the boxes that someone needs to check.
Mm-hmm.
And whoever fills in these boxes, I'm comfortable with them. I have no other problems. I have no problems with their local political affiliation whatsoever.
Mm-hmm.
Because I don't pretend to understand the local realities.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't wish to as well at this stage. My skin in the game is limited to the safety of my people, namely the Bharatiya diaspora, mm-hmm. period. So as long as their interest is secure and nobody interferes with their ways of life and does not reinforce negative stereotypes that they've inherited from the British master, I will certainly think of those options as viable options. Beyond that, I don't care.
Got it. You know, in the last few years,
I have not sidestepped a landmine. This is my honest answer, because it's easy to get mired in political conversations and forgetting what is truly at stake. Mm-hmm. And that's increasingly happening both in Bharat and here. Mm-hmm. That is at least my outsider's reading of the situation. Mm-hmm. So I'm more interested in understanding what should be our priorities and then focusing on who's best positioned to deliver the goods on those priorities, mm-hmm. as opposed to reverse engineering the person and then foisting my priorities on the person.
Got it.
Because that way I think you're trying to force fit your expectations on someone who doesn't fit the bill exactly.
Right, right.
So it's important for that conversation to happen. My only grouse has been that it's time for the Indian diaspora to actively take part in American public life. The extent to which they have contributed to other aspects of American society is vastly superior and therefore conversely inferior in terms of their contribution to American public life. You've lived here for 3 to 4 generations, it's time you made your presence felt. It's very important. And it's not just a question of a luxury anymore, I think it's becoming an existential imperative. Mm-hmm. That's my reading of it. Mm-hmm. So what is it that we are doing to coalesce? What is it that we are doing to put together the resources, both human and capital? Mm-hmm. And I'm not asking for a flexing of muscle as a show of strength. I'm just asking you to protect yourself in every possible way. Mm-hmm. Because the situation in this country is changing rapidly, And I suspect it's no more the America that you decided to plant your roots in. Next.
Well, I'm going to step a little bit closer to the landmine here.
Yes, please.
So you said that. So you ended with a very interesting thing. This America is not the America that you stepped in.
Yes.
I'll give you, and I have a couple of examples that might be related to what you're talking about. So we talk about Indians or Indian origin people in American public life, and one way to measure that is legislation that's being introduced, legislation that has to do with Indian origin people.
Right.
So as I'm sure everyone here is aware, in the last few years there have been state-level resolutions in California as well as in the state of Washington that have to deal with caste-based discrimination.
Right.
I'll just put that example out there. And I want to take that example and what you just said about the America that you came to maybe in the 90s or the 80s and the America of today. And I wanted to just put those two things out there, and I wanted to let you sort of explain the connection and talk a little bit more about what do you see happening in this country? Why do you say that it might not be the America that you originally came to? What undercurrents are going on?
There's a live audience which I can't ask for a show of hands. How many want me to answer this question bluntly?
That is everyone,
Good.
So we're going to do it. Okay.
Okay, good. So with the informed consent of the audience,
please. Glad we got that on the record.
We will be collectively responsible for the outcome. In 2019, I delivered a lecture in Pasadena. And I told them very specifically that you should anticipate what we call reservations in the private sector in the US through the DEI route. I said this in 2019. I was laughed off.
Wow.
And I said there was a legal proceeding which was underway then. I said it's not coincidence. Somebody is testing waters. And I think a soft underbelly stands exposed.
Mm-hmm.
And the caste narrative of Bharat will now be exported to America, is what I specifically said. Whether I stand vindicated or not is the question. But the question is, were people in a position to read all of this? Were they ready to respond to it? My honest, candid, harsh assessment is it was too little, too late. It was 11th hour reaction. Which also means that we were so busy with the STEM side that we did not pay enough attention to the humanities side. And that reflects very poorly on our ability to understand the power of humanities to shape minds and narratives. And I'm being benign about it. I think it's being used for thought control is my blunt answer.
Mm-hmm.
So I genuinely believe that it's time that at least now, the Bharatiya diaspora, the operative word being Bharatiya diaspora, takes the issue seriously and encourages the study of humanities. Otherwise, while you contribute tax dollars, your fate will be decided by people who shape policy. It's inevitably by people who control humanities. Mm-hmm. As simple as that. And I say this as a former engineer turned litigator who understands the power of innovation and the power of policy. Policy usually trumps innovation. So I think this was the first time where there were concerted efforts on the part of the Bharatiya diaspora to voice its serious, let's say, disagreement with the policy. Mm-hmm. Perhaps the last time was in 2016, the California book crisis. I think that was one of those instances. But between 2016 and 2019, has there been a greater ground movement for people to actively watch out? I'm not sure. I genuinely hope that these resolutions, what is it, SB 403 and something else, awakens them and they don't go back to their default state of slumber, civilizational slumber. because mischievous actors have firmly planted their feet here. And we should expect more tumultuous times ahead.
Mm-hmm.
2, you cannot hope to address this issue without getting into history whatsoever. A few weeks ago, I published a piece in the Indian Express. The title of the piece, and I'm going to stir the hornet's nest here. The title of the piece was, "Caste is a Western construct, so what?" Indian Express did something very mischievous. They edited the title of the piece and they didn't play it back to me before they published it. The title of the piece was, finally, when it was published, "Caste is a Western construct." So to anyone who reads the piece and focuses exclusively on the title, it seems I'm blaming the colonizer entirely for our caste structure. Whereas if you had actually bothered to read the piece, any lawyer would tell you, never judge a contract or a document by the name of the document. You look at the content first. Whatever it is, whether it's a license or an assignment or a transfer or a mortgage or a hypothecation, depends on what the document says, not what it claims to say. Okay? I specifically said, just as Dharma is not religion, caste is not Varna and Jati. I, in fact, went to the extent of saying that the hereditary nature of Varna and Jati need not be denied. But you need to go a bit beyond that to ask yourself, why have these fault lines emerged significantly in public discourse post 1857? And that year is crucial because that is the year that the crown decides to take over Bharat from the company. Okay? So you will have to deal with a bit of history, and you will have to make sure that history is applied to the present and it doesn't become an archival study, because you don't have the luxury of an archival study anymore. This is a real battleground. This can't happen with part-timers stepping into humanities. It's a battleground of its own. It needs its own set of qualifications. It needs people who are willing to understand the optics of it, who are willing to understand what to say and what not to say, because there's a huge landmine of politically correct filters in this area. Not that I care for it, I'm just saying. So that requires people to take this up full time. Now the welcome change, and which I think Bharat has initiated, is that people from the STEM side have transitioned into humanities and they've decided to apply their analytical skills to the STEM side, to the humanities side. And that, I think, is crucial, because the tendency of a person coming from the STEM side is to use evidence as much as possible to back their position and not fall prey to confirmation bias, where you decide a position and accordingly reverse engineer the evidence to support that position. Okay, so that, I think, has to start. But nevertheless, the bottom line and the larger picture, or perhaps the call to action that I'm making here is, kindly do not ignore humanities. If you choose to relegate it entirely to the margins, rest assured you will be pushed to the margins in a while. So please take it seriously is all I have to say.
Perfect. As we wrap up here, because I do want to leave time for at least a couple of, or at least one or two questions. You just said, great piece of advice, sort of be more in tune with the humanities. And Stanford is a very interesting school because, well, it was founded and its sort of time of rise was really through science and engineering. It's been very privileged to sort of bolster its humanities and social sciences heavily over the last couple of decades. So we have a lot of great people there too. But because we're a student group and our focus is Stanford students, and how do we get them sort of more involved in India's growth story and all the dimensions that you laid out. My final question, I guess, would be, what advice do you have to them, to the students that are sitting here, to the students that are watching online, not just at Stanford, but all over? What should we be doing? How should we be thinking about India's growth and from a civilizational narrative?
I have no doubts in my head that India's material success is destined. I'm more interested in its ability to retain its identity while this happens. And the challenge here is slightly more psychological, which is, how do we get Indians to look at Bharat from an insider's perspective and not an outsider's perspective? Mm-hmm. And that perhaps is a greater problem with people living here, not because there's a peculiar manufacturing defect, but because of the conditioning, because of the conditions you live in, and because of the system that you're exposed to, and also the fact that you don't live there. So one of the things that I've tried to address through whatever little I've been able to put out in the public domain is how do we get Bharatiyas to not see their culture through the prism of a tourist,
Right.
who's looking for cultural relics, but who has to look for living traditions and living societies. Understand them from their perspective, not to necessarily defend everything, but also not to start with the premise they need reform.
Right.
They need to be civilized. I think that the shelf life for that kind of an approach is way past. I mean, I think we are way past that.
Right.
So that, I think, is the trick. And that's not going to happen unless and until you actually are in active touch with your roots. Everything else follows from that. Allow me to say this, the so-called challenge is not cultural. It is not political. It is not economic. And it is certainly not, civilization is too soft a word. It is actually ontological. It is epistemology. And finally, it's child theology. These are areas where we need to invite more and more people into the conversation. So the first step is for you to understand your own culture better.
Right.
And the second step is for you to present it to the outsider as well as the insider better. If you don't do it, I suspect even well-meaning Bharatiyas who live here will buy into the narrative that was peddled by certain publications from the East Coast and the West Coast. Okay? New York Times.
East Coast, yeah.
I dropped it.
Right.
So I think it's very important that you have what it takes to defend your position. The problem in school, on school campuses and college campuses, is that Bharatiya students don't know what to do when they are faced with a volley of stereotypical allegations about their culture. They have no ammunition to defend themselves. Which is why the better part of my outreach has been with the student community in Bharat. And I hope to engage more with the student community here. I'm going to your slightly more mischievous campus here.
I know, yes, yes.
That's tomorrow.
Hopefully we had a much better welcome for you than they will.
I expect a very different kind of welcome.
Well, you'll have a different welcome there, yes.
I'm going prepared for it fully.
Right.
So the point is, this starts with, there is no shortcuts to this. There's no, 5-minute jujitsu here. There's a lot of hard work that needs to be invested in acquiring a clear sense of your own history, because it is your history that's being stereotyped and weaponized against you. Every aspect of your history, from your marriage rituals to whatnot, caste, of course, has been the traditional whipping boy. So I think, okay, whip in person, not boy. Okay. So you need to be able to understand it better. So knowledge production with respect to Bharatiya history is step one. And how do you then make it consumable for different layers and categories and shades and grades of audience? That is the next step. So student population, maybe you could take an active interest, and your clubs should have a pulse on Bharat's cultural discourse. Don't limit yourself to the political discourse. That's all I have to say.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have time for one question. So can I please get your hands up? Okay. This.
Start with the lady.
We'll go right here. Somebody with that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Namaskaram, Sai Deepak ji. Thank you so much for your speech and all the points you brought up. My question is, you mentioned epistemological challenges and how the current fight we're in is sort of a bigger ontological challenge. I'm wondering if you see the way we talk about development itself in India, when we talk about STEM and we talk about our technical expertise, would you say that we need a different way to even measure how the civilizational narrative can be pushed? And if so, how do you see that? Do you see that changing? And how would you push for such a change in the way we are talked about on the global stage, even when it comes to positive things?
I think it's a fantastic question that needed to be asked. My core area of practice as a professional litigator is intellectual property law. So when I say that development metrics and definitions have to be changed, people usually accuse me of hypocrisy. Whereas I say that precisely because I practice intellectual property law and I understand how development as a discourse has taken shape in other parts of the world, I'm also aware of the mistakes they've made. So what has happened is, whether it comes to culture or economics, the traditional path in Bharat for the better part of its independent existence has been to follow the trial and error of the West without applying its own original mind to it. Can we subscribe to the very same model, which is perhaps great for a population of 300 million and which is 3 times the size of Bharat? Would that work for a country that's 1/3 the size of US and 3 times the population at the very least? Now, when I say this, I'm typically accused of being a Luddite, someone who's anti-development and anti-innovation and anti-technology. I'm neither. I'm none. I am just clear that you need to find a way to genuinely uplift people's standard of living and quality of living, but equally be conscious of the acute resource deficit across the board. I know this is a very sensitive topic here. I certainly believe that climate change is a real issue. And I believe that I would be slotted as someone who comes from the conservative side of Bharat's ideological spectrum. And therefore, my belief in the existence of climate change is at loggerheads with the definition of a conservative here. So that's how the definitions change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, territory to territory. More importantly, as an active and a proud Sanatani who believes in the value of Dharma, I've said this before. Kalidasa's Raghuvamsam starts with a particular shloka, which is effectively a prayer to Shiva and Parvati as the parents of the universe. And they're typically seen as Purusha and Prakriti. So the existence of Dharma without Prakriti is impossible. There is no concept of Dharma or righteousness without nature or respect for nature. Precisely why I've said this in the dense, unreadable book that I've written, that if civilizationalism is used as a political tokenage merely to beat the other side in an argument, and it is reduced to a brownie point, then you will never apply it as an active filter and an active test when it comes to development or defining development. And for Dharma to be a real benchmark or a yardstick or a guiding light for our policy shaping, it needs to equally feature in our developmental discourse. So I completely agree with you that I genuinely hope that just as Bharat has shown both vertebracy and originality and independence in retaining its independence on the geopolitical front and on the international front, it does not allow the West to repeat its mistakes in the name of harmonizing laws across the world and in the name of access to markets. Because they are interested in your markets, but we have a long-term sustainable interest to cater to, which is our own existence. So I hope, to borrow an adage from the colonial master, we don't act penny wise and pound foolish. Next.
That's all we have time for, folks. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.